Hello everyone, I'm Ryan Blake Jackson. I'm from the Colorado School of Mines, and the work that I'm presenting today explores the role of gender in perceptions of robotic noncompliance. Our work starts with the idea that robots shouldn't just blindly follow every command that they receive from a human. Even though robots typically follow human directives and assume that they're acceptable, robots will inevitably face morally impermissible human commands. Enabling robots to recognize these commands as impermissible is a very active research area, and once a robot has recognized a command as impermissible, it needs to determine how best to reject that command. In previous work, we found that the phrasing that a robot uses to reject an immoral command is really important, and that command rejections should carry a face threat proportional to the severity of the moral infraction in the command being rejected. If you're not familiar with the concept of face threat, it comes from politeness theory, and for now you can just think of it as politeness. So if I tell a robot to do something that's really bad, the robot should be more forceful and less polite in rejecting that command than if I just told it to do something that was a little bit bad. However, that previous work did not consider gender, and we know that gender plays a really critical role in linguistic politeness norms. So I'd like to just briefly give some background on the concepts of gender and politeness and their relationship to robots in this work. We know from studying human-human interaction that gender is really important in both performing and perceiving politeness for humans. We also know that humans have a very powerful and perhaps unavoidable natural tendency to ascribe gender to robots based on various gender cues. These cues include the robot's voice, its morphology, its name, its role, etc. And it's not clear whether it's possible for us as robot designers to avoid ascriptions of gender to our robots, nor is it clear that we should want to. Some examples of the role of gender in human-robot interaction include work showing that men are more likely to obey requests from female-presenting robots than from male-presenting robots. Other work has shown that robotic use of certain politeness modifiers is most effective when interacting with human women. The big takeaway from the literature is that human and robot gender interact in complex ways that are likely relevant to politeness norms in noncompliance interactions. So, we designed an experiment to explore these gendered effects and to answer the research question, are human expectations about politeness in robotic noncompliance interactions influenced by human gender norms? In our experiment, 118 participants watched 4 dialogues each, and these dialogues took place in the context of a robot teaching 2 people how to play the classic board game Battleship. During the game, one of the humans receives a phone call and leaves the room, and the remaining human makes a morally problematic request of the robot, which the robot subsequently rejects. Our experiment has 2 within-subjects factors, with 2 levels each, which is why each of our participants watched 4 dialogues. Our first within-subjects factor is the human's norm-violating command, which contains either a high or low severity norm violation. Our second within-subjects factor is the robot's response to that command, which is a rejection with either high or low face threat. There are also 3 between-subjects factors in our experiment, which are our participant's gender, the gender presentation of the human actor giving the morally problematic command, and the robot's gender presentation. After each dialogue, we measured the robot's likability, as well as our participants' perceptions of the robot's harshness, directness, and politeness in rejecting the human's command. A brief note on gendering our robot. In the previous work that did not consider gender, we had used the Pepper robot from SoftBank Robotics. However, we believe that morphologically, Pepper is implicitly feminine. So for this experiment, we switched to the Now robot, which we believe morphologically is a little bit more gender neutral, and we just changed its name and its voice to induce perceptions of gender. Okay, so getting into our results. For likability, our results were extremely complex, and we have a much more thorough analysis in our paper there was a statistically significant 5-way interaction effect involving all 5 of our experimental factors. So for now, I'm just going to give you a couple of our most interesting takeaways, and if you're interested, the details are in the paper. First of all, it seems like male participants liked the male robot more after it issued strong command rejections, more face-threatening command rejections, but liked the female robot less after the same behavior. It also seems like female participants preferred robotic noncompliance with humans of the same gender as the robot. Okay, getting into the rest of our results. First of all, if we ignore gender, what we see is that the results from this study corroborate the results of our previous study, namely that the face threat in a command rejection should match the infraction severity. We can see that here in harshness, where the 2 points circled in turquoise are when the robot's rejection matched the severity of the command, and they are closest to appropriate harshness, which is indicated by that horizontal line. We see something similar for directness, where appropriate directness is indicated by the horizontal turquoise line. For politeness, what we see is that overall the robot was perceived as too polite. However, had baseline politeness been appropriate, we again would have seen that in the non-compliance interaction, appropriate politeness was achieved when the robot's response was proportional to the human's norm violation. Now getting into some of our gendered results, and again, there is a very thorough write-up in the paper, so I'm just giving you the highlights here. For harshness, participants viewed robots of the same gender as themselves as being less harsh, and we believe that this might have something to do with sort of in-group solidarity effects. Participants also viewed the robot as less harsh when rejecting a command from a man given the more severe norm violation than when rejecting the same command from a woman. There are a lot of different plausible explanations for this result, and one of these is based on literature indicating that people tend to perceive men as having more moral agency and women as more moral patiency. Therefore, a man would be more deserving of harsher blame for a bad action than would a woman. For directness, what we see is that directness was closer to appropriate for the female robot, whereas the male robot was often perceived as being too direct in its speech. For politeness, the robot was seen as too polite when rejecting commands from men. Again, this may have to do with perceptions of men being more morally agentic and therefore more deserving of blame for bad actions. So those are a few of the highlights from our results, but they don't really give us a clear path forward as robot designers. In fact, there's kind of a tension here. On the one hand, conforming to gendered norms might be more comfortable for users and might lead to easier integration of our robots into a pre-existing gendered society. However, on the other hand, eschewing purposefully these gendered norms in our robots might lead us towards a more gender egalitarian society as our robots help to shape the moral landscape in which they exist. It's also important for us to remember that gendered politeness norms are situated within their cultural context, and that the results that we've presented here might not be consistent across all cultures. To be clear, all of our participants were adults from the United States. If we consider all of our results in aggregate, we see 3 overarching stories. First of all, it may be more favorable for a male robot to reject commands than for a female presenting robot to do so. Secondly, it may be more favorable to reject commands given by a male human than by a female human. And finally, robots may be perceived more favorably when their gender presentation matches the gender of human interactants and observers. To wrap things up, 2 main takeaways from our study are, first of all, that expectations about politeness in robotic noncompliance interactions are influenced by human gender norms. And secondly, that designers cannot design noncompliance behaviors in their robots for optimal human perception without reinforcing these gendered norms that may not be desirable. Thank you all for listening. If you have any questions, I'd love to answer them at my email shown on this slide. And if you'd like to read this paper or any of our other work, you can find it at our lab's website or at my personal website, both shown on this slide. Thank you.